Just briefly, quickly showing the Moodle and updating it as well. So I think from yesterday, if I do a quick recap, what we've done is we've covered learning outcome 3 yesterday, and that was focused on essentially understanding, what are the various driving forces and why do leaders or management in particular face resistance within the organization when they're trying to implement change. So yesterday's learning outcome was looking at a couple of things in terms of the forces driving change and the resistance to change. So there were 3 frameworks that we discovered, basically studied in detail. One was the Edgar Schein's cultural model. We also looked at the 5 forces model, which was primarily to do with understanding when change is being introduced within the organization. What we normally see is there are forces which work for the change and there are forces which work against the change. So what we do with the force field analysis model is primarily look at ensuring that we chronologically order some of these forces which are working for and against, and then we look at doing risk assessments to see what is required to be done in order to ensure that these changes that are against basically oppression, changes which are opposing the change within the organization would then be mitigated, and then leaders can obviously look at implementing change. We also looked at the role of leadership. Role of leadership can be discussed in the aspect of looking at proactive and reactive, and this role of leadership, if they want to implement change within the organization, is preemptive or proactive, then obviously they are able to, put requisite, let's say, things in place, things like training and development, create a vision or a paper which basically explains why the change is being done, and they're able to win over the employees, and obviously their objections can be overcome before the change implementation process starts. In some cases, what we do see is that if change is being implemented on a reactive basis, then there are obstacles and obviously hurdles which leaders and management can face within the organization, because people who have been working within the organization for years do not feel that they need to embrace change. There is not much clarity in terms of what the change will effectively help basically what will be the ultimate effect of that change. There is a lot of let's say, I would use the word, there is not much of clarity or uncertainty regarding the change which is being implemented, because it's not been proven yet. And that is where there are reasons that sometimes change, when anticipated by leaders, tends to be reactive. And when it is reactive, they have to overcome hurdles and they find it difficult to implement change within the organization. So now the Moodle for this particular unit is fully updated. So I've also put in the learning outcome 4 presentation, and there are 2 various handouts which I would recommend, which I'll show you in the slide, which are recommended for additional reading as we go along in terms of studying this particular learning outcome. Now, in today's focus learning outcome, one of the things which I also want to briefly showcase, and I spoke about this yesterday, was that when you look at the unit specification for this unit, there are bits and pieces in this unit specification which clearly shout out and basically clearly draw your attention towards that some parts of it are theoretical, some parts require practical application, and some would require practice to be shown in terms of implementation and examples. So if I look at learning outcome 1, it talks about producing a comparative analysis. That means here, in order for us to understand what will be the evidence required to be able to do the assignment tasks, it will be related to producing a comparative analysis. That means we'll have to take 2 or more than 2 to be able to do comparative analysis of what are the drivers of change, how change can be implemented within the business, what are the different types of change and change models. The second one is purely theoretical. It talks about evaluate, but here again, we have to build arguments and we have to kind of, drill down into some of the theoretical frameworks and models that we have studied in Learning Outcome 2, which are predominantly change models and factors which can affect the organization from internal factors and external factors. The third one talks about investigation. So investigation would mean, again, where we are looking at putting across theoretical models like the five forces model. We are looking at the Edgar Schein's model. We are looking at other models of change. And what we're going to be able to do then is basically use those theoretical models, give the theory, and then show the application of theory by taking a relevant example. And that would help us understand how these change models in real lifetime, in terms of when you're working within the organization, are put to implementation. And that is where the examples would be required. The last learning outcome that we are studying today is basically talking about recommendations that we have to look at to make recommendations which are basically going to be related to a range of leadership approaches that can be used to bring across change initiatives within the organization. What does that mean? That means that when we look at the role of leadership becomes quite critical in certain circumstances when we look at organizations which are global, when we look at organizations which have various offices, regional offices, when we look at organizations which have a larger workforce. They have complex business models in terms of both the structure and the culture of the organization, and they are into lots of different products and services. So here, the context would be to look at suggesting approaches which could be utilized by the organization in the context of looking at tasks, activities, and challenges which the organization can actually face, and what kind of leadership challenges can be used to overcome those situations. And the change part of it can be, or the change of direction, change of say, for example, vision, or in how these products and services are delivered by the organization. A change in the route of delivery of these products and services can be initiated within the organization. So again, we will have to looking at taking examples to be able to give preferred recommendation, and that is what we will discuss in the assignment discussion session. So the unit, although is a theoretical unit, a purely theoretical unit, but parts and bits and pieces of the learning outcomes and the sessions that we have done also include areas wherein you have to use some of the key models that we have learned of change, like the Burke-Letwin model, Cotter's 8-step model. We look at the kaleidoscope bridge model. We will look at McKinsey's 7S model. We look at models which are related to change impact and study of its analysis, like the Boner Arnold model and the techniques. We also look at some of the leadership styles, and then we look at the models that are used by leaders effectively to bring across change within the organization, and they tend to be the force field analysis model. And this is where we are going to be looking at implementing some of these while we look at completing the evidence for the assignment, or compiling evidence for the assignment at a later stage. So today's learning outcome, we are looking at basically focusing on leadership theories and change models again, because in the indicative content, if I look at it, basically talks about we need to discuss what are the benefits and disadvantages of some of the key models that we've looked at in learning outcome 2. So here I've added a few tables primarily to clearly differentiate and highlight what are the benefits of using one model over the other, what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages. We'll also be looking at very briefly the leadership theories, because here sometimes leadership theories look at defining how the organization looks at embracing change. How does the process of change begin within the organization? Is it preemptive? Is it reactive? Is it proactive? It is reactive? It is preemptive? And what would be the leadership style which will, kind of also to a certain extent, let's say dominate in the way the change is being introduced. If you have an autocratic style of leadership, or if you have a democratic style of leadership, or say, for example, a laissez-faire style of leadership, transformational, transactional, there are lots of different leadership theories. And in some cases, you would see that if the leader behaves in a particular way, then you would generally see that the change, the nature and the way the change is implemented within the organization would closely mirror and depict what the leadership traits and abilities are in order to bring across that change. And obviously the role of leadership, that means the role of management and people who are at the top helm of the organization, is very important, because they tend to be executive sponsors. They tend to be people who are essentially either termed as change agents, or people who are essentially looking at driving change for the betterment of the organization, which is either looking at increasing revenue, looking at increasing market share, shareholders value, looking at changing the direction of the business if the existing products and services are becoming defunct or not, are in, the demand for them in the market is decreasing because of the rise of substitute products or other competitors catching on. So a lot would depend on, in terms of how leadership actually looks at from a point of view of bringing across this particular change within the organization. So we will get into this with a few slides and discuss today's learning outcome. Before I do that, what I want to do is just quickly focus on, what is leadership and why is it important for change. So one of the things which there are lots and lots of definitions of leadership. We can go with textbook and widely accepted definitions. What I've chosen to do is primarily put in a definition which I feel I understand and something that I can relate to. So no particular reference to any author or any particular person which has done a lot of work in this sector. But generally, when we look at leadership is defined as the ability wherein a person is able to get a group or a group of individuals together to follow what his particular direction or nature of direction of work is. And if you are able to get that group if you're able to get that group going to align with you in the objectives which are being set, and if they can believe what you are asking them to do is going to be good for them and for the organization, then that person would be termed as a person who's in leadership position. So essentially, they have the ability to be able to influence and get other people to follow them. So basically, that is what I would define leadership as. Now, leadership would have many traits and abilities. So if we are looking at somebody who says that I'm a leader, or basically gets into a position wherein they are expected to show, let's say, if I don't use the word leadership, they're expected to get their hands dirty and set an example that this is how things have to be done. Then they would have abilities to be able to inspire and influence others towards achieving a common goal. And that common goal and vision is set by them. So a leader would have lots of traits, including guiding, directing, motivating individuals or group of individuals within the organization to go after and achieve that desired outcome. Now, in some cases, you would also see that the leader will also have excellent communication techniques, and they would be in a position wherein they know very clearly how decision-making process works and where to delegate and where to ensure that the delegation of decision-making authority allows work to happen seamlessly or happen more efficiently. Now, leaders typically are, there are lots of different theories which I would, obviously put across in the next slide in the table. The great man theory says leaders are born with certain traits. And obviously, as the concept of leadership and theories have evolved over the years, what has happened is the viewpoint in terms of how these theories have shaped our understanding of leadership has also changed. So what we do get to see is that when we talk about leaders, we are talking about people who are effective. They are often characterized, I will put it this way, that they are often characterized by the ability to be able to communicate clearly. They are able to build trust. They are able to negotiate. They are able to have, when I say build trust, they are looking at building relationships and rapport with some of the other members within the team or, people within the organization. They are generally characterized by having a vision for what the organization or the business stands for. And they would clearly understand what are the circumstances under which, people and the businesses would need to work. And they in some cases, this is my own addition to it, is that a person gets into a leadership position when they have a number of years of experience and they have faced similar situations in the past. They have had the experience of actually dealing with a range of different types of, let's say, situations. And these situations could be situations which involve politics. It involves, obviously bureaucracy. It involves negotiation tactics, and also have the ability to be able to, at the end of the day, close when what they've started. And this would be a generic definition, of what I understand leadership tends to be. Now, why is it important in the implementation of change is simple to understand, is because of the fact that when we look at change being introduced within the organization, somebody has to take that bold step or the decision essentially to be able to bring across that change. And then that change would be maybe the change in terms of the direction of how the organization is going forward in terms of attracting business, looking at, market demand, looking at maybe thinking tangentially to what the requirements of the future consumers are going to be. And then they are able to create a working paper or a draft, which then allows others to understand why they feel this is going to be the way forward. And that allows the leaders to actually start the process of change within the organization. Now, they are visionaries. Sometimes we talk about people like Steve Jobs, and you talk about Elon Musk nowadays quite a lot, and you talk about a lot of other leaders which are basically trying to do best for their businesses. Sometimes we do also hear terms that leaders are looking at doing best in terms of achieving the best outcomes for all stakeholders. Now, stakeholders could be shareholders, employees, staff, partners, suppliers, distributors, the extended ecosystem. But there are lots of different aspects of it in terms of why they are looking at doing this. And obviously, the main underlying aspect tends to be increasing either profitability, market share, or revenue. And that is where leaders are focused. But they're also focused when we look at the rise of the gig economy. Most of the new businesses which have come across in the gig economy are products and services led. So they have been involved in the creation of what is called a unique product or a service that allows them to create a USP or a serviceability in the market. And that is where leaders come in. And in some cases, some of these organizations are undergoing change. So when we look at the launch of Facebook, when we look at the likes of LinkedIn, we look at Deliveroo, Uber Eats, Uber as a service, these organizations have gone and embraced tremendous change. And that has happened because leaders see that if this change is not implemented within the organization, then there are going to be significant amount of hurdles for the organization going forward. A case in point that I would explain here is, if you look at Uber, a very successful, unique business model based on location-based services. And if you look at the previous CEO, of Uber, obviously did not embrace the labor changes, which were, which were basically looking at mandating, changes that here Uber drivers also need to have the same rights as workers. And in some countries, there were lawsuits which were filed against Uber as a company. And obviously, at some stage, when we look at previous CEO Travis, who co-founded the company in 2009, had to step down. There were other reasons of him stepping down, but one of the main reasons also being that he was not looking at giving Uber drivers the worker status in many, many countries, which means that these workers also have rights to things like statutory sick pay, minimum leave, and certain amount of other benefits which a worker would get. So in the UK, they lost the case, and then the Supreme Court made a ruling that Uber workers or Uber drivers should be classified as workers, and these workers have 8 different types of rights as a worker within the UK. Now, this change, because there are different lawsuits in different places, what has happened is the current CEO of Uber, has embraced this ruling in some of the countries, and what he has started to do is proactively proactively started to implement this change in other geographies where Uber operates. And the current CEO, which is Dara Khosrowshahi, maybe an Iranian guy, but obviously when he joined Uber in 2017, he was primarily the CEO of Expedia Group. and he has implemented similar changes because Expedia Group is also a brick and mortar model. A lot of their workers, currently work from home, or the services are cloud-based, and in those cases, some of these things which Uber has experienced, that company has also experienced ages back or years before that. And what has happened is, with him embracing that change which is coming in, although reactively, is helping Uber operations in different countries to mitigate these law cases or cases against them in the courts. And that has meant, in a way, it has meant that the leadership is now instrumental in proactively initiating change in countries in which Uber is expanding. So obviously they're keen to expand the business, but they also want to look at now embracing some of the changes which have been put forward by legislation and law. And that is why the role of leadership, to a certain extent, is very important, because under the leadership, they can continue to invest in self-driving technology, and also at the same point in time look at introducing innovative solutions. So Uber introduced Uber Eats, Uber delivery, of other things. They are introducing some more revolutionary changes in transportation and logistics. But this allows the leadership to basically focus on the innovation side of things, but at the same time accepting that this change needs to be implemented within the organization. So in various aspects, taking different examples, you would generally see that leadership at some stage or the other is, keenly involved in bringing across change within the organization. Now, when we look at leadership approaches and leadership, theories, there are lots of different leadership theories which are available, and they have undergone lots of changes over the years and decades. We started off with the trait, behavioral, and situational leadership theory. Today, more or less, transformational, transactional, authentic, and servant leadership theory is more or less, prominent within the organizations. And here is where we do get to see that when we talk about transformational leadership, one such example which I take and it comes to my mind is, if you look at Dell Computers as an organization, when the iPhone and iPad came out, the organization was the de facto go-to-market model, which is what they had introduced, which was built-to-order PC models, and it was a market leader. But with PC becoming marginalized as one of the devices to be able to access internet, and the popularity of iPhone, iPads, or tablets essentially started to grow, he came back to helm. He had taken retirement. He brought back the company out of private equity holders, took the company private, and then kind of transformed the vision of the organization to embrace that, okay, we need to now change with time. PC is not going to be the only device, and they started to diversify into cloud-based products, and obviously have now their own set of products which closely mirror, or have at least the offering on this side in terms of tablets, laptops, which are running on Windows, and some of the other devices which allow access to the internet, and obviously the larger ecosystem. So an example of transformational leadership, because Dell, being highly profitable, started to lose money big time in the years in which he had taken retirement, and he brought back the company into black from red. And that is an example of transformational leadership, by coming in and changing the direction of what products and services and how it goes to market, help Dell survive. Otherwise, the company would have, become defunct, or, would have disappeared from the landscape altogether. So there are lots of different types of leadership approaches, and we need to be aware of some of these models that we talk about in terms of leadership theories. There is a handout that I have, which I will upload on Moodle. It's a 17-page handout which summarizes all the possible leadership theories that we can think of. And that is a summarized handout which probably looks at a summary of about 200 pages from different places. And that is a good read for you to get a detailed idea about leadership theories and leadership approaches. Now, for the purposes of the indicative content, there are three which are mentioned primarily, when we look at change management. One of them is situational leadership. So a situational leadership is depending on the situation the company is faced with, or the problem or the issue the company is faced with, the leader would look at bringing across or using what is called situational leadership. Here, it is more about some sort of a directive style of leadership, which means that the leader will take the lead and provide very clear instruction of what is to be done in a situation, because the organization and most of the employees within the organization have not faced that situation before. And the leader or person in that position has had an experience of that particular situation in maybe a different setup, and that allows that person to be able to use situational leaderships to be able to steer the company into a particular direction. We look at transformational leadership, which I've given you an example of Dell. So here, the organization or the leader essentially looks at inspiring and motivating the staff within the organization to accept the change or the change of direction in which the organization is going to move. And this is normally done by people who are well respected and are considered visionary in their role. And that is where using their personality, their communication, their ability to be able to clearly give and, let's say, explain or lay out the vision of the company allows the employees and staff to follow in the foothold and in the directions of, what is being introduced as a change. And here, the person looks at encouraging people within the organization to think creatively, look at risks, and there is a co-ownership in terms of decision-making process till the time the change is being implemented. Then we look at psychodynamic approaches. Now, in these approaches, what we look at is the individuals within the organizations are generally controlled, or let's put it this way, generally would be looked at asking or being asked to embrace change on the basis of, putting in incentives and motivations or rewards in place. And this tends to be the case wherein individuals would look at different, if you look at the Maslow's hierarchy of need, there are different needs for different individuals. And what the organization does in this case is, when we talk about, psychodynamic approaches, here the organization would primarily look at, identifying what does the individual need. And according to the need of the individuals, they will put together, rewards and incentives in place, which will be closely related to the change which the organization is trying to embrace. There are some core principles of psychodynamic approaches. And here, what we do get to see is that there is unconscious motivation. There are some early experiences. There are, obviously relationships which play a clear and a very important part, which allow leaders to be able to bring across this change within the organization. So as the word, when I look at the word psycho in particular, if I look at the dictionary meaning of the word psychodynamics, if I'd say psychodynamics, and if I look at the dictionary meaning of the word in terms of what does it mean, what we will clearly see is that the word refers to the interrelationship of the unconscious and the conscious, forces that determine what an individual would do in a particular situation. So here, using relationship, using the attributes of, I would say experiences and motivational techniques, the leaders try to bring across change and obviously avert power struggles which may happen if the organization is undergoing directional change, or the leaders introduced a directional change in the organization. Now, one of the things that we will look at in terms of ultimately what leadership style or approach actually works within an organization will depend on a lot of different factors. These factors could be internal and external. It could also depend on the nature and task of challenges which the organization is facing and what kind of workforce that the organization has. Now, sometimes you see if the organization has a lot of matured workforce, they are going to be only, swayed by motivation and rewards, essentially. But if there are organizations which have a balance of young and, mature and experienced workforce, you would generally see that the organizational culture and structure of the organization will play a key part. And that is what leaders would look at, let's say, depend on, would look at, say, let's put it this way, exploiting those particular aspects of how the organizational culture and dynamics work, and they would be flexible in, kind of using these as levers to be able to bring across change within the organization. Now, sometimes we see, if I take an example of a small business, sometimes you do get to see that in small businesses, it is easier for directors or company directors to be able to bring across or get the sales team to accept, let's say, larger targets year on year, is because of the fact they know that as a business they are growing. They also know that the employees are hungry for success. And if I put in more motivation in terms of rewards and incentives, I would be able to get my way in terms of, asking these employees in sales or the BD team to be looking at targeting for more. Now, there is a win-win for the leader here, is because of the fact that if they even fall short of target, the company's turnover or revenue is still being increased, because there's a lot of scope for the company to increase its turnover. And as it is a small business, it has the opportunity to be able to go from a small business to a small medium enterprise. So there is tremendous room available for expansion. So here the leaders normally would use what are called psychodynamic approaches, and these approaches would be a balance of using their own experience, looking at motivation, and looking at the relation of how employees would be motivated by rewards and incentives to be able to drive them towards accepting larger targets, for achievement. So any questions so far?
Sir, regarding the psychodynamic approach,
Yes.
Is it a standalone leadership style or an add-on skill that a leader has to develop?
Well, there is a lot of research which has been done on psychodynamic approaches. There are a couple of theories, and these theories propose certain techniques which basically can be used to influence employee behavior, their emotions, and obviously interpersonal relationship within an organization. So this is not a standalone approach. This is an approach which is essentially based on, a theoretical aspect of what the Sigmund Freud theory is. And here, when we talk about the Sigmund Freud theory, his theory is applied within this context to look at, leaders adapting, I would say, philosophical approaches. So when we talk about Sigmund Freud in particular, we look at this approach, which is a very well-known theory in terms of psychology within the larger domain of organization behavior. And his theory basically suggested that human behavior can be influenced by lots of different things. And that is what the approach of unconscious memories and looking at dynamics comes into play, which has been introduced in the case of leadership. So when I say psychodynamic, leadership or theories or approaches, it will fall back on Sigmund Freud's theory, wherein it is the central core theme of that theory was looking at human behavior and how it is influenced by motivation, by previous experiences, and also by rewards and incentives. So this theory then allows leaders to look at treating employees in a different way, depending on their demands and obviously depending on their needs. But they will use these three traits, of previous experience, the motivation, and rewards and incentives to be able to drive the change within the organization. So your question, in short, it is an approach based on, it's not a standalone approach, it is an approach based on human behavioral theories, predominantly focused on Sigmund Freud's concepts of the theory that he had introduced in organization behavior. And this would deal with using behavioral aspect of what individuals would do, and leaders would actually use that aspect to be able to drive change within the organization. Is that okay?
Yes, sir.
Now, there are various interpretations of this particular theory, but majority of the work has been done by him and his team. And sometimes when we use the analogy of, when we look at the iceberg, for example, and this is a very common analogy that comes across, across various units that we will study. You see the iceberg, but half of the iceberg, or more than 3/4 of the iceberg, is under the sea. And that is a conscious view of how you look at things. And that fallbacks into what is called the psychoanalytic theory of Sigmund Freud. And that is related to bringing the approaches of human behavior into leadership. Because at some stage, when you become a leader or you have the responsibility of being a leader or leading a team, you would need to have a very good understanding of what is human behavior, how do you influence that behavior by using motivational techniques or motivational incentives and rewards, and how do you bring across your previous experiences or experiences that you've had in say a previous role or a setup, and then use them essentially to shape the change required to be done within the organization. Now, one of the other things that we briefly want to look at is there is something called the nudge theory. Now, the nudge theory, when we talk about, is a theory based on how the idea, is based on the idea that how the environment shapes up the, decision-making ability of a particular leader. So in this case, I would look at, this is a theory which has, again, a lot of connotations. But what we would want to do is basically, when we understand the nudge theory in the context of, leadership, what we are looking at is basically theoretically understanding, the model of leadership here, and how does leadership use, this theory to be able to bring across change within the organization. So when I talk about nudge theory, this is a theory which has originated, from the concepts of behavioral economics and also political science. So a good example that I've included here, which I'll discuss in the next slide, is how do we bring across a change within a workplace. So sometimes when you look at nudging somebody, sometimes we use the term that I need to nudge somebody, or, I need to push somebody into a different direction. You give an idea and then you push that person or nudge that person to be able to go in that direction of thinking or that thought process of thinking. So this particular theory is a concept which takes its beginnings from behavioral economics and also from a bit of political science, because it suggests that you can bring across changes or subtle changes within the organization in a small and a regular, in a small or a broken down fashion. And as you implement these smaller changes, by the time you finish the implementation of these smaller changes, you'll be able to also have an impact on the behavior of the individuals working within the organization. So this theory, in short, looks at introducing change, but looks at introducing and adapting to change depending on how the people who are embracing this change also react. And in smaller portions, you bring across, you break the change that is a big change or a major change, but you break it down into smaller portions, and then it allows you to go through this process in a much more easier and a way which is more acceptable to employees within the organization. Now, in the context of leadership, obviously, we need to look at nudge theory. So this is one of the theoretical models which allows us to bring across change within the organization, maybe through a 7-step process. But in the context of leadership, what does it mean? So when I look at leadership, what I'm looking at is that here, leaders would essentially look at using this theory or theoretical model to look at encouraging positive behaviors. That means they're going to nudge you in that direction to encourage you to for example, be more productive. They will ask you to also, when they're asking you to be productive, they'll ask you to take more breaks. They'll ask or make sure that resources for you to be able to work in an environment are also available. They will say, for example, also look at, if I look at Google as an example, you look at Google's campus. They have ensured that people, when I say people, I mean staff or employees working within the Google campus or Google offices, feel as if they are working from home. And the reason why they have created this as a environment is because they want to nudge employees towards a direction to say that you have ownership, you feel at home, you can work from the office, but you have all the basic amenities of what you would need to be able to, let's say, encourage work and keep them motivated, encourage them to work, and encourage them to complete the work on the timelines which are given. So here, things like the pods, the washrooms, the extracurricular activities, the availability of healthy snacks or in restaurants within the campus, all of these things then allow and encourage employees to take breaks, eat healthier, but at the same time get the work done within the organization. Now, this theory, if I look at from implementation to Google, will also say that it also reduces what is called, negative behaviors within the organization, because the organization and the leaders are seen to be able to discourage any negativity within the organization. They look at making sure that all the benefits in terms of comforts are available for people to be able to work within the offices. Now, with these two things going in terms of reducing negativity and encouraging positive behavior, or making them feel at home while they are at work, also then looks at building support for decision making. And this building support for decision making is basically the essence where the leaders are nudging the employees to support their decision-making process by ensuring that they are feeling at home, they are having all the amenities and requirements to be able to do work. And in this case, this particular support that they get, because they are providing all the necessary benefits to employees to be able to work in a very good environment, then kind of does a buy-in, from the employees to support any change which is happening within the organization. So this 7-step process talks about leaders defining the changes clearly, considering what could be the change which the employees would see it as a perspective or go under. They will look at evidence for and against it. They will maybe make some changes to look at negative aspects of what it is contributing towards change, and then do away with the negative aspect by listening into feedback, changing some part of it if it is possible, and then looking at implementing this change because they have had a buy-in from the employees. So nudge theory is a tool which leaders use, and it is quite important for them to use this because they understand what are the needs and wants of the employees. They encourage positive behaviors, they reduce negativity, they overcome obstacles, they take feedback, and they involve employees in the decision-making process. And this then allows them to, when I say them, I mean employees to embrace change, positively. So in this case, this is a theory which primarily, again, is a theory which can be applied, to bring across change within the organization. Now, one of the things I would say, an example. One second. Just a quick one, yeah. So now when we look at, how do we look at taking an example of and looking at putting this in context in terms of nudge theory. So if I look at, say, for example, what are the benefits of, nudging in a workplace? And how do we look at, changing behaviors for employees to be able to go across and accept change? So nudging here would refer to a method wherein you're trying to steer one's behavior in an intended direction. And this is subtly being done by introducing certain motivators which the employees need, in order to win them over. Now, here, for example, when we look at, pictures on, say, for example, burgers on restaurants and, cigarette packs and things like that, what the organization, or in this case, advertisers are trying to do is they're trying to create identifiable trends which could either relate to you, or it could be not relating to you and irritate you, or in some cases look at let's say initiating a certain type of behavior which they want to observe. And using this particular aspect of nudge theory, what they look at is behavioral economics and the political science, which suggests that when you try to introduce changes, as I mentioned earlier, in the environment, these changes have to be introduced. If there are drastic changes, these changes have to be introduced subtly in order to make sure that this does not have a big impact on the people's behavior or employees' behavior within the organization. So sometimes you would see they would introduce a change, but they would step back. An example of this would be, say, for example, if a change is being introduced and it's not being accepted by employees, normally you would see that the change or the change process is slowed down slightly or put on hold, and training and development is put into place, or feedback analysis goes into place. Once the process is complete and they know what are the objections or hurdles coming, then the change process again starts. And then what they will look at is, now they know how to, when I say now they know, means the leadership and the leadership team knows how to react and how to look at reacting to the challenges which are being faced, because the feedback has already been taken. And this way they slowly and gradually run through the change which is required to be done within the organization. Now, when we look at this aspect of change, we also look at one of the other aspects of how change is initiated within the organization. Now, there is a person by the name of Hayden. Now, Mariano Hayden and his colleagues, in 2016 did a study across some 450 organizations globally, and they basically wanted to understand that how does say, for example, change affect the organization, but in particular, they wanted to understand how can change be initiated by middle managers and executed by top executives, wherein it creates the strongest support from employees. Now, when change is sometimes driven from top management, what tends to happen is that it could be in some circumstances not clearly acceptable by people down the chain. That means in the middle management and in the lower management, or people within the frontline services. And this is where sometimes if the change and the change process is not communicated clearly by the top management, creates dissonance. And this means that there is very little support that the top management is able to garner for the changes which are being introduced within the organization. So what Mariano Hayden and his colleagues did when they studied, they tried to put together a study wherein they studied that if change is a process is introduced by the leadership or the top management, but it is given by the top management to the middle management to execute within the organization, then what they see that the change was more effective. The employees were more willing to accept the change. And this kind of, ensured that as a process, the change was pretty much, going to happen within the organization. So top management sometimes is also classed with the fact that they say that, okay, they are delinked from what is happening in the front lines of the organization, or what is happening, say, for example, in terms of what the day-to-day operations of the organization tends to be. So their research into the study of 450 organizations kind of revealed that when change is being done, it can look at two different ways, or two different variations can be done. And one is change is initiated by the top management, which is most commonly seen in organization. And when you look at initiating change via the middle management and the involvement of middle management, you see that change is more influential because it enjoys more support from the employees who are going to do or implement this particular change. Now, so in effect, what they did was, this particular study recognized that when we look at change being initiated by top management and executed by middle management, works well and in favor of the organization, and generally there are very little hurdles or obstacles which are faced. And this means that the middle management who is dealing and managing the employees in any case, have a very good understanding of how the change process needs to be executed, who needs to be actively involved in managing that change, how the rollout of that change could happen within the organization, including say planning, communication, and alignment of that change. And that would mean the middle management tends to be more influential in dealing with this process of change. And this process is also then let's put it this way, this study also then had a far reaching outcome, in the sense that when we look at large organizations, what tends to happen in large organizations is that when change is being initiated, what the leadership does is it structures the change to be introduced in the organization in a way wherein they decide on what is happening or what is required in terms of change to happen. But at the same time, what they will then do is let the middle management, or the people who manage employees as middle managers, would have the ability to be able to bring across the change into the organization. And this change which is introduced and executed by the middle managers kind of makes it much more effective for people to be influenced, and obviously to embrace that process of change which is happening in the organization. And this is what is depicted in this particular slide, because when we talk about initiating change, generally speaking, change is always initiated by the top management or the topmost person within the organization, and they fail to create a paper or an action plan which is then required to properly implement and explain the changes which are going to happen in the organization. So the involvement of middle managers allows this to be put together, structured, and then implemented in a way which is more acceptable by organizations. Any questions on this so far?
No, sir.
Okay, now we look at some of the other aspects of the learning outcome in terms of what is the impact of change when we look at leaders initiating change. So, for example, if we look at a new CEO joining the organization, and sometimes you would see that the new CEO brings across, or the new head of the company brings across a subtle number of changes in the organization. Now, these changes which are introduced primarily tend to be changes for, either increased control, increased productivity in terms of efficiency and time, looking at reducing cost, or in some cases, looking at increased opportunity of making sure that some of the operational aspects of the organization could be streamlined in order to achieve better outcomes. So generally, when we look at leaders and when they come in and look at making change in the organization, you would generally see that the changes being done are done to bring operational efficiency. Operational efficiency can be further classified into, for example, looking at the aspect of reducing costs, looking at the aspects of increasing productivity, say for example, reducing headcount to increase profitability. In some cases, they would also look at taking back some decision-making authority back into their control, which would allow them to control the process of authority, or maybe decision-making, which would mean that employees, middle managers would need to fall back on the top management in cases where decisions are required to be taken. And what they would look at is, in general, they would look at ensuring that the organization would be looking at the best possible approach with regards to what are the current trends or factors affecting the business in the market. So changes when they are introduced or initiated by leaders, they tend to have very clear and very cliched outcomes in businesses which are well established. Increased control, looking at increasing productivity, reducing headcount, operational efficiency, increasing profitability, increasing the bottom line, and in some cases tightening up on certain conditions like credit, and looking at let's say introduction of I would say certain technological advancements in the organization, which makes decision making and the process of decision making more centralized and decentralized. Some cases centralized, and in some cases decentralized. So this tends to be the effect of why leaders would want to initiate a change primarily in a running organization. Now, let's look at what could be the impact of this change if they introduce some of these changes because of the change of leadership in the organization. Generally, when a CEO comes in or a vision of the organization is being changed, or for example, a 5-10 year plan for an organization is being created, you would generally see that there are some changes which are subtly implemented in those long-term planning. And these changes could be implemented in order to recognize opportunities which are coming the way of the organization in the future years, or it could be because of some reduced opportunities which are going to go away. That means the business is looking at changing direction over the years, and this planned change tends to be bringing reduced opportunities. Now, one of the things which I would give an example of is when you look at the Amazon and the Amazon bookstore when it started in the early 1990s, 97, 98, 99, and then the traction on the business started to happen in 2005, you would generally see that Amazon was one of the online retailers. But during COVID, what we see is a big transition happening, wherein the preference has now shifted to buying online as against in-store. Obviously, this concept is different in different countries. But if you look at developed countries, because of the ease of buying, returns, and virtually endless inventory that you can browse through, people have more become accustomed to buying online. But in developing countries, it's still the brick and mortar model. And obviously, there's a careful balancing act which has to be done in order to ensure how much or how many channels you have to sell online vis-a-vis the on-ground that you have, to be able to interact with customers and take feedback and, take inputs from customers. So here, if a long-term change has to be introduced in the organization, which is seeing that the trend is moving online, and we see reduced opportunities being created from a point of view of people coming to stores to be able to buy, then in those cases you would see the leadership would start to look at reducing the number of stores being opened, maybe looking at closing a number of stores over the years, which would allow it to save cost or reduce cost and reduce headcount. Second thing that you would also look at is that sometimes when changes are imposed onto the employees or staff or within the organization, it tends to have a direct effect on the morale of the employees. And this would then be seen as a cascading effect or a scaffolding effect on how the output of the organization is coming year on year. So generally, you would see decrease in productivity. You would probably see employees leaving, higher turnover in terms of manpower. That means more employees leaving because of either being frustrated or not being able to work when they had authority or decision-making authority to be able to take and make decisions. And in some cases, you would also see that new policies and procedures being introduced to tighten up the working requirements within the office would, deter employees from staying within the organization. This would slowly and gradually lead to what is called resistance to change. So when we look at how within the organization, sometimes the mood of the organization changes from positive to negative or from positive to essentially revolt, in terms of not agreeing to or showing resistance, you would generally see that this would happen over a period of time, and there would be certain contributing factors, things like low morale, things like changes which are happening, but these changes are not benefiting the employees or people working within the organization. And last but not the least, what you will also see is that the changes being introduced are not consulted with the employees before they are done within the organization. So in this case, you would generally see the resistance to change starts to increase. And what that would mean is at some stage, it will start to affect the workflows and the productivity within the organization. And that would mean that at some stage, leadership would need to look at bringing in change. And that change which they bring in would essentially be, change either in the direction, employee, or the management itself in order to get the organization back on track in terms of productivity, revenue, sales, turnover, whatever that is. One of the other effects that you would generally see when we look at the impact of leadership when the changes are imposed is that relationships suffer. There is a decline in the trust levels between the employee and the manager and the management of the company, and this degrading of trust or decrease of trust which can happen. It'll not happen immediately. It'll happen over a point in time, and that would mean that at some stage, the organization would start to feel the effects of lower productivity and obviously lower efficiency, and that would be seen as a direct indicator of the outcome, which is turnover and profitability of the organization. So when these changes have to be introduced, sometimes again, it is very clearly mentioned that when changes have to be introduced, they have to be introduced in tandem with the employees, consultation with proper consultation, and if they are seen to be imposed or reactive to a market situation but without consultation within the organization, you would generally see that these changes tend to be detrimental in the long term for the organization and the employees working within the organization. Now, one of the key things that we want to quickly look at in the second part of this session is looking at change models. So when we look at Burke's, Letwin's, change model, we have these three-step model of unfreeze, change, and refreeze. And this particular model is quite, popular when change is being introduced. What you recognize is that there is a need for change, and this need for change can then be looked at in terms of managing attitudes and behaviors and ensuring that there is a strong support from the management to bring in this change. And then what you do is you start the process of change by explaining how the change will affect your day-to-day working or an employee's day-to-day working. And while implementing the change and the changes, what you're going to do is look into and get feedback from employees to ensure that any course correction which has to be done can be done rather than doing it towards the end. And the last phase tends to be refreeze, which means that in some cases, when we look at taking the changes and the final implementation of changes are to be done, what you will generally see is that when changes are reinforced by policies and procedures, then what the organization tries to do is it tries to integrate the changes into the normal way of doing things day to day. And this would mean in some ways that they have to maintain and sustain this change as a process which has happened. And what they need to be able to do is encourage this change and an embracing of this change within the organization. So clearly from Burke Letwin's view, this particular process is a three-step process wherein you refreeze, which is basically unfreeze, which is introspect. You look at implementing the change, and then you refreeze it, which is to say that there's no going back to the previous ways of working. And that is where this model makes perfect sense. Now, there are lots of advantages and disadvantages. Disadvantages was what we need to understand. So this particular process and the model, if used to bring across change, can sometimes be complex and difficult to understand. That when are you unfreezing or understanding the requirements to be done for change? When is the change process starting, and when does the change process finish? So there is a very thin line differentiation between the three stages, and sometimes employees fail to embrace or understand when was change introduced, or the process of introduction of change was induced, when it was completed in terms of implementation, and when does the new process and policies start to show effect is not very clear to the employees. Now here, it requires a significant amount of time in terms of doing analysis to gather data and obviously to look at how you would draw up a comprehensive plan for change. And sometimes some of these changes cannot be fully managed because of human factors, things like behavior, culture of the organization, structure of the organization, and then obviously opposing forces which are looking at opposing the whole process of change. And last but not the least, we also see in terms of there are sometimes within a large organization, multiple sets of initiatives which are currently running. So there is not, let's say, what is a good time to start implementation when some of these changes or actions finish. So there is no set specific timeline in terms of how these changes can be phased out within the organization. And this is because there are multiple activities happening, and this tends to be, a disadvantage. We look at the Kotter's 8-step model. Now, this 8-step model looks at driving change, and basically Kotter divided it into 3 stages. So one is, when you look at introducing change in the organization, he said that you need to create a climate for change. You need people to accept what, and they need to explain to them clearly what changes are required, why they are being done, and what are the benefits of those changes which is going to happen. Then you engage and enable the organization in terms of resources, in terms of communication, in terms of ensuring that, the staff or the people which are going to undergo change have the ability to be able to, access all resources and then successfully transition using this change. And the last tends to be, when you implement the change, what you have to look at is also sustain the change which has happened within the organization. You can't go back to your old ways and techniques of doing things. So here there has to be a clear way in terms of redesign of policies and procedures which would allow them to be embedded. And this embedding of policies and procedures, will allow the organization not to go back to the old processes, but they will look at rather embracing the new ones. And there is enough, documentation, work, and let's say, resources available to be able to follow through on the new direction rather than go back on to the old one or depend on the old one. And again, what I've done is I've explained some advantages and disadvantages. The third model is ADHE's model. Now, in this particular model, Prossi, who was the founder, basically came across this particular model after studying, 700 different organizations. So when we talk about the ADHE model of change, what we are basically looking at doing is, in this case, this particular model, is going to be looking at a structured approach of how do we manage change by focusing on the 5 key drivers which are required to bring across a successful change within the organization. And he devised these 5 drivers as ADHE, which is the acronym. So A for awareness, D for desire, K for knowledge, E again for ability, and R for reinforcement. And each of these drivers essentially have and show some characteristics. So it has some benefits and, let's say disadvantages. The benefits tend to be that the model is very clear and structured in terms of how to manage change within the organization, because that you need to start with creating awareness, then a desire for change, then you have to, give knowledge. And then knowledge would mean training and development has to be done to be able to embrace change. And then you need to have employee workforce, which has the ability, the skills to be able to embrace that change. And then finally, once the change has been implemented, you have to reinforce it, which means that you have to ensure that there is an ongoing feedback process, which allows employees to, provide feedback. And this allows the organization to embed change within the culture and then the structure of the organization. Obviously, there are disadvantages as well. And these disadvantages tend to be that sometimes this process can be too long. It can be complex. It can be less effective in certain types of businesses. And it could be, that not all types of businesses could apply the 5 stages of the ADHE model in order to, embrace change within the organization. So we need to know clearly which model and how you can actually adapt this particular model of change and then implement it within the organization. The last one that we are looking at is McKinsey's 7S model. So when we talk about the McKinsey's 7S model, or framework of change, basically, what we are basically talking about is that McKinsey, when the work was being done, he recognized that organizational change, requires hard and soft skills. It cannot be that the leaders are able to just instill and push through with the changes which they want to do in the organization. They have to fall back on their hard and soft skills. And this model is an approach which was created by Tom Peters and Robert Walterman in the 1980s. They were, both of them were management consultants, and they identified 7 key elements that they see within the organization which need to be aligned in harmony, or as they say, need to be aligned in harmony to be able to then apply or make changes in the organization. So he started with both of them as consultants started with these 7 S's, which are strategy, structure, systems, shared values, skills, staff, and style. And what they essentially concluded is that there are several benefits to identifying these key let's say success points, which would allow then change to happen within the organization and the organization to benefit from change in terms of implementing that change. Now, what it does is obviously it provides and takes into account a comprehensive view of the organization and its key elements, because it takes into account everything which you would generally want the organization to look at when they try to implement change. Things like long-term strategy, what is the structure of the organization, what kind of systems they have deployed, what are the shared values of the employee, the vision and mission of the organization. They want to look at, making sure that they have enough skilled employees, or the employees have skills which are going to be required to bring across that change within the organization. And then whether they have what is called the style. That means the leaders are having or showing the appropriate traits and leadership styles to be able to, enable and then make sure that the company is able to take that journey of change within the organization. And then when they look at change, they also look at staff. And when I say staff, what it means here is that they look at the capability in terms of human resources. That means, do we have the number of employees or the skills and the experience with the employees to be able to bring across this change? And this framework tends to be, quite advantageous because of the fact that it takes into account all the possible variables which could affect how the organization embraces change. Now, this model also has advantages and disadvantages. So when we talk about advantages and disadvantages, quite a few disadvantages tend to be that, again, it can only be employed in organizations which are big and large enough or have, complex structures, which would mean operations in different countries, geographies, and it is big enough in terms of scale to be able to apply because you're taking into account strategy, structure, systems, and, all the other bits which are required to bring the change. Now, sometimes this particular model will not allow you to understand the external factors which can affect the organization because you're too focused on understanding the internal factors itself, things like staff, leadership styles, skills within the organization, values, systems within the organization, the structure of the organization. These are all essentially internal factors. So you're totally negating the external factors, which could be political, economic, technological, legal factors, which could also affect how the organization would embrace change. So every model that we look at studying, which is a change model, it is worth noting that some of these models have benefits and some have, they have benefits and disadvantages both. They can be non-exhaustive, but effectively, when we look at organizations considering change, they will need to carefully look at a particular model and evaluate whether this is the most appropriate change model that they need to look at using to bring across change within the organization, because some of the models will focus on internal factors, some will focus on external factors, some will focus on some of the behavioral aspects of change management, and some of them will primarily be looking at the psychodynamics, which is primarily looking at just the individual and employees. And that is where the organizations have to very carefully select these models before they use them to be able to bring across change within the organization. Now, one last model which I want to briefly cover is basically kaleidoscope approach, which is primarily talking about the kaleidoscope approach of change, which is basically, if I put it this way, I think some of us in our childhood, have looked at the kaleidoscope approach, or the the aspect of looking at things from a different perspective. So this particular model, if I look at kaleidoscope. So let me bring let's say a kaleidoscope, and when we talk about this as a toy that we've used, it is the word, essentially, I would put it this way, it is actually a toy which normally we have used as a tube with some broken mirrors in the middle, and then every time you move that tube, you are able to see different designs which come across, or different patterns which come across because of the changing design, positions of the mirrors, and they tend to be producing then different patterns, from a point of view of how you would see the situation. So kaleidoscope is essentially, changing patterns, if I have to put it this way, rather than, give you an example of that toy wherein the tube actually contains mirrors, and obviously they are pieces of glass which obviously when moved produce different patterns. So the analogy here is that when we look at the change kaleidoscope, which is constantly changing patterns or sequence of changes which are happening within the organization, what we will look at is the kaleidoscope model of change. Now, this model was essentially proposed by Dr. Brenda Zimmerman and Dr. Sholem Globerman. Now, their model suggests that change is a complex process and it is an unpredictable process. So there are two words which are important to understand the kaleidoscope framework. One, change is complex and change is unpredictable. And the change would be affected, the change which you're trying to bring within the organization or would be affected both by internal and external factors. And when we look at kaleidoscope approach, it takes into account three elements. It takes into account path, perspective, and paradoxes. So when we look at path, it charts out different possible routes that can be taken to achieve that change, desired change. Perspectives, it takes into account different viewpoints and experiences of both individuals and groups in order to implement the change process. And the last, not the least, when we talk about paradoxes, what we mean by that is that there are sometimes conflicting goals and values which can inhibit the process of change within the organization, because you have goals and you have values and which have been defined at the start of the organization in your strategic plan, and sometimes they can be at loggerheads, and that is where it could pose paradoxes. That means you have conflicting goals and values that can sometimes create problems in terms of how the change is being implemented within the organization. Now, the kaleidoscope model also emphasizes the importance of recognizing and managing these three elements. Which are these three elements? You look at paths, perspective, and paradoxes. So what you will do is basically look at considering them carefully to understand that there is complexity and unpredictability in the process of change. And this can, both complexity and unpredictability can be affected by internal oblique external factors. And here some of the potential, limitations of this particular process tend to be because of the fact that you are looking at, various aspects of time, scope, diversity. So if we look at, the three elements, which is talking about paths, perspective, and paradoxes. So if I look at path, could be what is the change that the organization is trying to achieve, whether it's going to be in the case of capability or capacity. And if we look at, paradoxes, in what context it is going to look at this change, whether it's going to look at it in the context of diversity or preservation of diversity within the organization. And when we talk about paths, we are looking at whether the organization would be ready, would have the time and the scope and the power to be able to, from leadership, the ability to be able to bring across the change within the organization or not. So this model tends to be quite a valuable tool for leaders because it helps them navigate the process, this complex process of change, by breaking them down into three parameters, and three parameters can be broken down further into power, time, scope, preservation, capacity, capability, diversity, and readiness. So again, this is one of the models which can be used by you to bring across change within the organization, but it will again depend on whether the organization feels that this is the right change model process, a change model to be implementing and to bring across the change in the organization. And again, you will look at some of the factors in terms of whether they are closely related to the kind of change that you're trying to bring in the organization. And they would be the three aspects of paths that the organization wants to take, what are the perspectives in terms of change, or what are the takes which different individuals have in terms of embracing that change. And last but not the least, are there any conflicts happening between the goals set and the values and missions of the organization at the outset, to which will make the change process successful or unsuccessful. So again, an important model from a point of view of looking at implementing change within the organization. Now, there are two important articles which I would suggest that you should go ahead and read. And these two important articles, when you look at reading, would give you a very good idea in terms of, why sometimes we feel change is best implemented by middle managements or the middle management within the organization. And this is an article by Wendy Hirsch, which basically talks about initiating change, a fresh look at middle management's role. And the second article is an article on Forbes, which talks about why change management is most critical with regards to leadership skills. And this article is going to help you understand the role of leadership in terms of bringing across change within the organization. Now, with this particular discussion of Learning Outcome 4, we come to an end of this particular unit as well, and we would be looking at doing an assignment discussion in terms of this unit for next week. So any questions on this so far?
No, sir.
Okay, good stuff. So what I've done on Moodle is there are the copies of the LO3 and LO4 presentation, which I put across. And I've also uploaded the two handouts, which were shown yesterday. And they are going to be helpful for you to, understand the Learning Outcome 3 in terms of the theoretical aspects of the force field analysis and the Edgar Schein, organizational culture model of, bringing across leadership, basically about leadership, but looking at how it influences barriers and, opposing forces or barriers and for forces towards the change within the organization. So these two handouts are going to be useful for reading Learning Outcome 3. And for learning Outcome 4, I put, the two links on the last slide. And what I will also do is add a leadership theories, handout here, which will be useful for you to understand and go through all the different types of leadership theories that we can, think of as far as, leadership theories are concerned. So this one also I'm going to add here as a bit of, additional reading, for Learning Outcome 4, because there are lots of different types of leadership theories. And what we would want to do is basically understand some of them in the context of, how they've evolved over the years and what is the relevance behind each of the theory or the thinking behind the theory. So this particular handout on leadership theories basically covers all of the ones that we need to know of and have come across, from the initial great man theory onwards to the transactional transformation theory up until the early 2000s. So a good handout which summarizes and helps you get an idea in terms of what leadership theories could be useful for you when you're trying to implement change within the organization. So I hope this has been useful, this session, and what I will do is catch up with you next week in order to discuss the assignment for this particular unit. And until then, if you think of any questions or if you have any queries, feel free to drop me an email and I will come back to you on that.
Okay, sir.
Okay, thanks for